I need to tell you something I've never said out loud before, not even to my therapist, not until recently. I'm 63 years old, and for nearly 4 years I let a man convince me that everything wrong in our home was my fault. From the outside, we were the couple people pointed to at church and said, "Isn't that sweet? She found love again." But behind the front door of his beautiful craftsman house on Magnolia Drive, I was disappearing one small piece at a time. And the only reason I'm here to tell you this is because of a single question my daughter asked me the afternoon she found the shoebox I'd hidden under my side of the bed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Carol. I was 59 when I met my second husband at a community pottery class at the rec center in Asheville, North Carolina. I'd signed up mostly to get out of my apartment. My divorce from my first husband had been finalized 14 months earlier, after 28 years of what I'd thought was a stable, if quiet, marriage. It turned out he'd been quietly building a separate life for the last 6 of those years. No dramatic confrontation, no screaming. He just told me one Tuesday evening over reheated pasta that he'd been seeing someone, and he thought it was time we both moved on. My youngest, Amy, was 24 and already living in Charlotte. My son Mark was in Portland with his wife and their baby. I was 57, alone in a city I'd moved to for my ex-husband's job, with no close friends and a part-time bookkeeping job I'd taken just to have somewhere to be 3 days a week. The pottery class was my daughter Amy's idea. She'd signed me up as a birthday gift and made me promise I'd actually go. I almost didn't. I remember sitting in my car in the rec center parking lot for 11 minutes, talking myself into walking through the door. Daniel was already at the wheel when I came in. He was 64, tall, with thick gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He'd been an architect for 35 years before retiring, and you could see it in the way he held himself, precise but unhurried, like someone who was used to making careful decisions. He laughed easily and without self-consciousness. When my first attempt at a bowl collapsed sideways, he leaned over from the next station and said, "That's actually better than my first 3, and I believed him. We started walking to our cars together after class. Then walking to the coffee place across the street before class. Then he asked if I'd like to have dinner somewhere we could actually hear each other talk, and I said yes before I'd finished deciding. Daniel had been divorced for 7 years. His ex-wife, Linda, had left him when his work travel became too much, or at least that was the version he offered early on, gently and without bitterness. He had 2 adult children, a son in Atlanta and a daughter in Raleigh. He spoke about them with warmth and regularity. He asked about Mark and Amy by name and remembered the details I'd told him. He brought me a book about the Blue Ridge Parkway because I'd mentioned offhand that I'd always wanted to drive the whole thing. He showed up to our 4th date with a small potted rosemary plant because I'd said I killed every herb I tried to grow, and he'd said he knew a trick for rosemary. I told Amy about him after our 3rd month together. She was cautious in the careful way young people are when their parents start dating again after something painful. She asked good questions. She wanted to meet him. When she did, she texted me afterward, "He seems genuinely kind, Mom. I think that's real." After 8 months, he asked me to marry him. We were sitting on the porch of his house, the one he'd designed himself with wide windows and a kitchen garden along the south wall. He didn't make a production of it. He just took my hand and said he hadn't felt this settled in years, and that he'd like it very much if we could do this life together properly. I said yes. I called Amy that night and she cried happy tears and asked what I was going to do with my apartment. I told her I'd sell most of my furniture and move in with him. It was the logical thing. His house was beautiful, paid off, large enough for both of us. Mine was a rental anyway. We were married the following spring, small and simple, in the backyard of his house, with our children standing in the afternoon light. I remember thinking, this is what a second chance actually feels like. I was so grateful to be wrong about how the rest of my life would go. The first 6 months were genuinely good. We cooked together on Sunday afternoons and took long drives on the parkway in October when the leaves turned. He was attentive without being smothering. He told me I was interesting, and I believed him because no one had said that to me in years, and it felt like water after a long drought. The first small thing I noticed was so minor I wouldn't have been able to identify it as a thing at all, not then. I'd been invited by a woman from the pottery class, Diane, to join a book club she was starting. Dinner once a month at rotating houses, 6 or 7 women, a novel, a bottle of wine. I mentioned it to my husband over breakfast, excited in that careful, slightly guilty way I'd learned to be excited about things after my first marriage, like I might be asking for permission I shouldn't need. He looked up from his newspaper. A book club. Yes, Diane from Pottery is organizing it, first Thursday of every month. He set his coffee down. That's the evening we usually do our grocery run and meal planning for the week. We could do it a different night, I said. Wednesday, maybe. He was quiet for a moment. I just think Thursday evenings work well for us. We have a rhythm. He smiled then, easy and warm. You know how I am about structure. It helps me function. I'm sure Diane will understand if your schedule doesn't work out. I told Diane I had a prior commitment on Thursdays. She was gracious about it. A few weeks later, she mentioned they'd changed to the first Wednesday of the month and asked if that worked better. I said I'd have to check. I never got back to her. I told myself I was choosing my marriage. That's what compromise looks like, I thought. You don't get everything. You pick what matters most. The comparisons started around month 4. They were never harsh, not at first. More like observations offered with a tone of mild confusion, as if he genuinely couldn't understand why things were different now than they'd been before. Linda had kept a particular brand of coffee he liked, the one in the green can, and he'd assumed I'd know that. Linda had taken her shoes off at the garage door so the hardwood stayed clean. Linda had never bought the kind of dish soap that left a film on the glasses. I bought the green coffee. I started leaving my shoes in the garage. I switched dish soaps twice until the glasses met his approval. I told myself these were small adjustments. Every relationship has an adjustment period. He wasn't being cruel. He was just used to things a certain way. I was the newcomer in this house. It seemed reasonable to accommodate. The silences started in month 7. I'd made dinner for his son and daughter-in-law when they came through Asheville on a road trip. I'd been nervous, wanting to do well, and I'd overcooked the chicken because I'd been distracted trying to keep the conversation going. His son was gracious about it. His wife said she loved the roasted vegetables. My husband ate quietly, and afterward, when they'd gone, he loaded the dishwasher without speaking. I asked if everything was all right. He said, "Fine." I asked again. He said, "I said fine, Carol." The next morning he was polite but distant. One-word answers. Eyes on his phone or his book. When I touched his arm he didn't pull away but didn't respond either. Just waited for my hand to leave. I didn't know what I'd done. That was the most disorienting part. I went back over dinner in my head. The overcooked chicken, obviously. Had I said something wrong? Talked too much? Not enough? After 4 days, I apologized. I'm not entirely sure what I apologized for. Something about the dinner, about not being more prepared, about letting him down in front of his family. He listened, and then he put down what he was reading and said, "I appreciate that. I just want us to do our best when we represent this family." Then he kissed me on the forehead and went back to his book, and I stood there feeling simultaneously relieved and confused and vaguely ashamed, like a child who'd been forgiven for something they didn't entirely understand. That became the pattern. Something would go wrong, named or unnamed. The temperature in the house would drop. I'd survive several days of cold distance. I'd apologize. He'd forgive me warmly, briefly, and then we'd go back to normal, and I'd spend the next stretch of time trying harder, monitoring myself more carefully, looking for the thing I might do wrong next time. He began commenting on how I spent my days. I still did part-time bookkeeping from home, 3 clients, nothing demanding. He'd ask what I'd done with my afternoon, in a tone that wasn't quite accusatory, but wasn't quite neutral either. If I said I'd gone for a walk, he'd note that the kitchen needed sorting. If I said I'd called Amy, he'd say something about how we should probably focus on building our own routines before outsourcing our time to family. That phrase stayed with me, outsourcing our time, as if a phone call to my daughter was a business inefficiency to be optimized away. I started keeping the calls short. I'd step outside to the kitchen garden and speak quietly, always with one eye on the driveway. If he came home while I was on the phone with Amy, I'd say, "I have to go, honey," before he'd even fully parked. Amy noticed. She asked me once, midway through our 2nd year, "Mom, do you seem rushed when you call? Or is that just me?" I told her I was in the middle of something. She let it go. I could hear that she wanted to say more. The Linda comparisons escalated quietly, the same way everything did, in increments small enough that each one felt survivable. He began referencing her in the context of my shortcomings so regularly that I started to feel I was in competition with a woman I'd never met and had no way to measure myself against. Linda had hosted dinner parties for 12 without getting flustered. Linda had managed the household accounts without help. Linda had understood that he needed 30 minutes of quiet when he came home before he could engage in conversation. I implemented the 30-minute rule. I'd hear his car and make sure I was in another room, giving him his decompression time, monitoring myself like a new employee on probation. One afternoon, I was sorting through boxes in the spare room, boxes of my own things I hadn't fully unpacked after the move, and I found a photograph of Mark and Amy when they were small, maybe 8 and 10. Standing in front of the Christmas tree in our old house in Ohio, Mark had a gap-toothed grin. Amy was holding a stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion for years. I sat on the floor and just looked at it for a while, not crying, just remembering. That version of my life felt so far away and so fully gone that it produced a particular kind of grief that's different from sadness, more like standing at the edge of something. My husband found me there. He looked at the photograph in my hand. Going through old things? His voice was careful. Just found some photos of the kids when they were little, I said. He nodded slowly. You know, I put Linda's photos in storage the first month after the divorce. Honestly, it helped. Closure is a real thing. These are pictures of my children, I said quietly. He sat down on one of the boxes across from me. I know that. I'm not saying get rid of them. I'm just saying there's a version of the past you're holding on to, and I sometimes wonder if it's making it harder for you to be fully present here. With me. With this life. I didn't answer. He got up and went back downstairs, and I sat on the floor for a long time. I put the photographs in a shoebox. I slid the shoebox under my side of the bed. I didn't look at them again, but I couldn't bring myself to put them in the garage. I stopped calling Mark. He and his wife had their hands full with 2 kids under 4. I told myself I didn't want to be a burden. The truth was, I'd stopped knowing what to say about my life. He called me on my birthday and I made myself sound cheerful and busy, and we talked for 12 minutes, and I said I had something on the stove. The incident that changed something fundamental inside me happened on a Saturday in November, our 3rd year together. I'd agreed to meet Diane, the woman from Pottery, for coffee. We'd stayed loosely in touch through occasional texts, and she'd reached out to say she'd be in my part of town, and could we finally catch up. I'd mentioned it to my husband the night before. He'd looked up from his laptop. Diane, the book club woman. Yes, just coffee. An hour, maybe 2. This Saturday. Yes, we have the Hendersons thing Saturday afternoon. This would be morning. I'd be back well before. He was quiet for a moment. I just find it a little strange that you're choosing to spend the morning of a day we have plans running around with someone you barely know instead of being here, getting ready, being present for something we're doing together. It's coffee, I said. It's 2 hours. He looked at me with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite disappointment, something more like pity. Linda would never have done this. Made me feel like I was asking too much just to want my wife home on a Saturday morning. He closed his laptop and went to bed. I texted Diane that something had come up. She was kind about it. A few months after that, she stopped reaching out. The party at the Hendersons was perfectly pleasant. My husband was charming, funny, the version of himself that other people saw. On the drive home, he held my hand. I stared out the window and tried to remember who I'd been before I learned to schedule my own feelings around his moods. Mark called me in February, unannounced, early on a weekday when he knew my husband would be at his woodworking co-op. I answered and knew immediately from his voice that something had shifted. "Mom," Amy called me. My stomach dropped. She said you haven't been yourself for a long time. She said you rush off the phone. She said you've turned down every invitation to visit for 18 months. What's going on? I almost used my standard answer. I almost said, things have just been busy, we're settled in a routine. But the word routine caught in my throat because I'd heard it used so many times as a reason I wasn't allowed to have anything of my own that it had become the most frightening word in my vocabulary. "I don't know how to explain it," I said instead. "Try." I talked for 40 minutes. I told him about the silences, the comparisons, the book club I'd declined, the photos in the shoebox, Diane, the Saturday morning coffee that had become a marital crisis. Mark didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Mom, does he ever scare you? Physically?" I thought about it honestly. "Not the way you mean. He's never touched me in anger. He doesn't yell. He's just relentless. Quiet and relentless." "That's still something, Mom." "I know," I said. And I did know, by then. Some part of me had known for a while. But knowing and doing something about it are two completely different things when you're 62 and your closest family is 400 miles away and you've spent 3 years becoming smaller. 3 weeks after that phone call, I was making dinner when the room tilted. I'd been lightheaded for days, not sleeping well, eating less, that low-grade, constant stress that eventually adds up to something physical. I reached for the counter but misjudged the distance. I went down hard onto the kitchen floor, catching my shoulder on the cabinet handle on the way. I didn't lose consciousness entirely, but I couldn't get up. I lay on the tile looking up at the ceiling and thought, with strange calm, here we are. My husband found me when he came in from the garage. He knelt down, genuinely alarmed. He called 911 before I could tell him I was fine, and for a moment, lying on that kitchen floor, I saw the person I'd thought I was marrying. The fear on his face was real. His hands on my shoulders were gentle. At the emergency room, the attending physician was a woman in her early 40s, with a calm, matter-of-fact manner who reminded me slightly of Amy. She reviewed my vitals and asked about my history. Blood pressure was high. I was dehydrated. I'd lost 11 pounds since my last physical, which had been 19 months ago, which she noted with the particular neutrality of medical professionals who are actually saying something much louder than their tone suggests. My husband sat beside the bed, attentive, answering questions I should have been answering myself. When the nurse came in to do an additional assessment, the doctor said she needed to examine me privately and asked my husband to step out for a few minutes. He left. The door closed. The doctor pulled her stool close to the bed and looked at me directly. "Carol," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Not for me, but for yourself." She paused. "How are things at home?" 4 words, the simplest possible question. And something in me buckled completely. I didn't cry immediately. I opened my mouth to give the automatic answer, the "everything is fine, I've just been stressed" version that I'd rehearsed into habit. But what came out instead was, "I don't know how to answer that anymore." She waited. I told her. Not everything, not right away, but the outline of it. The silences, the comparisons, the slow erosion of my friendships, my time with my children, my sense of what I was allowed to want, the way I'd learned to manage my behavior around his moods like someone diffusing something that might go off. She listened, without writing anything down, just listening. "What you're describing is a recognized pattern of coercive control," she said. "It's a form of abuse. I know that word feels too large for what you're describing, because there are no bruises, no one is shouting. But the isolation, the emotional withdrawal as punishment, the constant comparison and criticism, these things cause real damage, and they tend to escalate." I told her I wasn't some young woman with no resources. I said I was 62 years old and had survived a divorce and built a life, and I should have seen this coming. She shook her head. "Abusers are specifically skilled at being invisible at the beginning. That's not a failure of your judgment. That's how this works." She kept me overnight for observation. She contacted a social worker, a woman named Grace, who came in before evening rounds. Grace gave me a pamphlet and a hotline number and sat with me while I read through a list of warning signs printed in clear, plain language, and I had the strange, dissociating experience of recognizing almost every single item, not as something I'd read before, but as the last 4 years of my life, described from the outside, in terms I'd never let myself use. That night, alone in the hospital room, I let myself think about Amy's question from 6 months earlier. She'd called me on a random Tuesday afternoon and I'd been distracted and short with her, and before she hung up she said, "Mom, when did you stop telling me things?" I'd said I didn't know what she meant. But I did know. I'd stopped telling her things at almost exactly the same time I'd learned that having my own feelings was something I had to hide. I called her from the hospital room. It was past 9. She answered on the second ring. "Mom? What's wrong?" I told her where I was. I told her what the doctor had said. And then I told her about the shoebox under the bed. That seemed important somehow, that I'd hidden photographs of her and her brother under my side of the bed because I was afraid of what it would mean to look at them where he might see, that I'd been protecting our old lives from the person I'd married. Amy was crying before I'd finished. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "I knew it. I kept telling myself you were happy and I was projecting because of what Dad did, but I knew." She asked me what I needed. I told her I didn't know yet. She said that was okay. She said she and Mark had already talked, that they'd been talking for weeks, quietly, comparing notes, worried but not wanting to push me before I was ready. She said, "We just need you to let us help." My husband picked me up the next morning. He was solicitous and warm the entire drive home, asking if I was comfortable, if I needed anything, if the doctors had been good to me. I answered in short sentences and looked out the window at the mountains and thought about what Grace had said. You don't have to decide anything right now, but start thinking about what you want, not what keeps the peace, what you actually want. Over the following 3 weeks, I did something I'd never done in 4 years of marriage. I planned quietly, carefully, and alone. I called a family law attorney from the parking lot of the grocery store. I gathered my financial documents slowly, one folder at a time, and photographed everything on my phone. I called my bookkeeping clients and told them I might be relocating and asked if we could move to a fully remote arrangement. They all said yes. I wrote down, in a small notebook I kept in my coat pocket, specific incidents, specific dates, specific words. I'd heard women told their memories weren't enough. I was determined to have more than memories. I'd been keeping notes in that same small notebook for 3 years, actually. Snippets of the things he'd said, dates of the silences, incidents I couldn't make sense of in the moment, but needed to hold somewhere outside my own head. I told no one about it, but I realized, writing in it those final weeks, that some part of me had known all along that the story I was living would eventually need to be told somewhere. Amy drove up on a Thursday morning in March while my husband was at his woodworking co-op. He went every Thursday from 9 until noon. I knew I had 3 hours. She walked through the front door and held me for a long moment before either of us said anything. Then she helped me pack. We were efficient and quiet, moving through the house with a focus that surprised me. I took my clothes, my documents, my bookkeeping files, the small things that were mine and only mine. I took the shoebox from under the bed. I left everything he'd given me, everything we'd bought together. Everything that was his or ours or in any way entangled. I left a note on the kitchen island. "I'm leaving. Please do not contact me. My attorney will be in touch." That was all. No explanation. No apology. I'd spent 4 years explaining and apologizing, and neither one had done anything except teach him that I could be managed. I was done managing. The drive to Charlotte took 2.5 hours. I sat in the passenger seat of Amy's car and watched North Carolina go by and felt something I hadn't felt in so long I almost didn't recognize it. Not happiness. Not yet. Something quieter. Room. Like I'd been holding my breath for 4 years and had finally been allowed to exhale. The divorce took 9 months. My husband's attorney argued that I was emotionally unstable, that the separation was sudden and unexplained, that I was making decisions not grounded in reality. My attorney presented documentation, the notes in my small notebook, the medical records from the hospital stay, including the physician's observations. Grace, the social worker, provided a written statement. 3 of my former clients confirmed that I was rational, organized, and had maintained consistent professional responsibilities throughout the marriage. In the end, I received a settlement that acknowledged my financial contributions to the household and restored the savings I'd entered the marriage with. I did not get anything I didn't already own. I didn't want anything else. I live in Charlotte now, 10 minutes from Amy and her partner. I see my grandchildren, Mark's kids, twice a month when they visit. I started working with a therapist who specializes in coercive control, which is the clinical term for the specific kind of abuse I experienced. I want to be honest about that word. It took me a long time to use it without flinching. Abuse felt like a word for something that happened to other people. Younger people, people in more obviously dangerous situations. But my therapist showed me something important. The absence of physical violence doesn't mean the absence of harm. What was done to me was deliberate, systematic, and real, and the damage it left is real too. I still have mornings where I second-guess my own decisions before I've made them. I still catch myself listening for the temperature shift in a room, reading the air for someone else's mood before I've checked in with my own. My therapist says this is normal, that the nervous system learns things it takes time to unlearn. I believe her because I've already unlearned so much. I went back to pottery in January. Different class, different rec center, but the same sensation of sitting at the wheel and making something with my hands that didn't have to be perfect to be mine. Diane reached out when she heard I'd moved to Charlotte, because the world is smaller than it seems. We had coffee last month, and I told her most of what I've told you, and she listened the way good friends do, not to respond, just to witness. It was more than I deserved after 4 years of silence, and she gave it without hesitation. Mark calls me every Sunday. Amy and I have dinner together most weeks. I keep the photograph of them as children on my nightstand now, in a small frame I bought at a shop in the No-Da neighborhood, where Amy took me on my first weekend in Charlotte. Mark with his gap-toothed grin, Amy holding the rabbit, the Christmas tree green behind them. I look at it every morning. If you're listening to this and something I've said sounds familiar, please hear me when I tell you this. It doesn't have to be loud to be real. It doesn't have to leave bruises to be damage. The slow, quiet erosion of who you are, the way you learn to make yourself smaller to survive in your own home, the isolation that happens so gradually. You don't notice you've lost everyone until one day you look up and you're alone in a house full of someone else's rules. That is a real thing, with a real name, and you are not too old for it to apply to you, and you are not too embarrassed to ask for help. Call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The number is 1-800-799-7233. They are there for situations that look like mine, quiet and invisible, and hard to explain from the outside. They will not judge you. They will help you figure out what your options are, even if you're not ready to use them yet. Tell one person you trust. Your doctor, your child, your sister, a friend from a class you stopped attending. Tell one person and let the isolation begin to crack. Keep a record if you can. Not because you're planning anything, just because your own memory can be made to doubt itself. Write things down somewhere they can't be taken from you. And please know this. What happened to you is not a reflection of your intelligence or your strength or your worth. People who do what my husband did are specifically very good at doing it. That is not a failure of your perception. It is a feature of theirs. I'm 63 years old. I left a marriage that had taken almost everything from me, and I built something new on the other side of it. Not all at once, not without help, and not without mornings where the grief of it hit me harder than I expected. But I built something. I am still building something. You are not too far in. You are not too old. You are not too alone. And you are absolutely not the problem. You never were,